Well, hi everyone, and welcome to Chapter 2. This is a Chapter 2 lesson, Roots and Meaning of Culture. Before we get started, don't forget to make sure you know what's due by going to the Blackboard Weekly folder, which has everything that's basically due this week. And be sure you know your deadlines for the week. So this image right here is an image of Jerusalem. It's an image I took in a trip there. And it's an amazing place. If you ever get a chance to go, I highly recommend it. Talk about roots and meaning of culture, religion, history, ethnicity, language, everything just sort of comes into play in this area. It's a beautiful place anyway. So I highly, highly recommend you go there if you get a chance. So let's look at, what is culture? Culture is the learned patterns of thought and behavior characteristic of a population. It's basically the sum total of a people's way of life. Culture is learned. You're not really born with it, you learn it. And it really depends on where you're born and to whom you're born. I mean, you could be someone who is Japanese, but if you're born in Florida, you're going to have a very different culture and way of thinking about the world than if you were born in Kyoto or Sapporo, right? So it's all about learned patterns of thought and behavior. Look at this image here, the idea of the role of women in society. The woman here with this very distinctive black hijab and clothing attire versus a woman just to her right, which would be basically a woman that's wearing, a backpack, regular clothing, nothing, no head gear, jewelry, very, very different. So the imprint of culture, what you see, not only in things like television and nowadays social media and the news, but also just walking about, okay? Here's another great look at imprint of culture. So here is the idea of religion, and this is an image from the desert Southwest, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah. It is both Native American in its background, but also Roman Catholic as a function of Spanish influence in what we call the western part of the United States, southwestern portion of the US, northern Mexico. Here's another imprint of culture, and this is a fake river on top of a real river that was a project done as part of the former West and East German reunification. And it's an interesting because it's an engineering device, and it's a canal that is above ground and over an actual river. So it's like a river over a river. And, this gives you a sense of engineering, it gives you a sense of culture, but it gives you a sense of the imprint of that culture, something that can be materially seen, not only when you go there, but above it, when you fly over it, and sometimes even from space, quite frankly. Components of culture, there are 6 of them, and the further down this list you go, the bigger they are in scale. So traits, complexes, systems, regions, realms, and at the end, globalization, which is something that we all belong to, quite frankly. So that's the idea there. Let's look at traits. Think about the units of learned behavior, the tools, the languages, the objects, the techniques. And you know how this can change in the US, for example, from state to state, region to region. Think about how different New England is to, say, Texas, or how different Texas is to California, and how different California is to the South. So really depends where you are. Cultural traits, it could be the clothing, it could be the jewelry, it could be the color scheme used. You think about complex. Complex is a whole bunch of traits put together, so an assemblage of traits. And so, for example, Islam, you're talking about the idea of the Quran, the writing, the clothing, the region, in this case, the Mecca, and where they have to do a pilgrimage once in their lifetime at least to that location. This is the world's biggest mosque at Mecca, so it's a cultural complex because it's a whole bunch of things sort of put together that identify it as Islam. You could do this with Christianity, you could do this with Judaism, you could do this with Hinduism, you could do it with any religion. A cultural system is a broader generalization than a complex, so it refers to a collection of individual traits and complexes. So as we mentioned, Islam in Saudi Arabia versus Islam in Indonesia. And if you think about Islam in Indonesia, it is not Arab. The people look Asian. And so they speak a different language, and they have different food tastes. So that in and of itself looks different, smells different, tastes different. And then cultural region. And in the end, let's look at a cultural region here. And I think I used this map last week. It's an old map from an old edition of the book, but I think it's still worthwhile showing. I always like to think about Portugal, Spain, Italy, Greece. When you think of those are places that are more red wine heavy. They rely on olive oil a lot more. It's more of that. They share a palette of food items. And you would never confuse that with, say, Scandinavia, where you're talking about things like herring and other fish and lingonberries and other such items that you would never find in Italian cooking or Spanish or Portuguese or Greek. Okay, so it's the idea of a region. You know, as you go from Spain into France, this whole region becomes more it's just different. Switzerland, Austria, Germany, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg. And then you have the United Kingdom, which is itself separated by water. So that gives it kind of a different sort of look and feel. Okay, cultural realm. Think about the idea of Latin America, North America, Islamic Africa versus Sub-Saharan Africa in different places like that. Or realms, if you want to think of them as you would, break it up into regions. Okay? And then finally, the biggest component of culture would be globalization, and this is the homogenization, the blending together into sort of a big global culture as economies and other cultural aspects become intertwined. Think about what you own. You own everything that you own, whether it be your Honda or your Subaru or your Kia or your Samsung Galaxy or your iPhone or your Google phone. It's not mostly made in the US. It comes from somewhere else, and that's globalization. Your Adidas, your Nike, your Reebok, your Puma, the hoodie that you love so much, the pair of Uggs that you may wear, all that stuff, it comes from somewhere else. And if you think about a place like, say, the Woodbury Common or any outlet mall that you may go to, it is just a global collection because most of those stores have components in Europe and the United States and Asia. And think about a store like Uniqlo, or think about a store like Old Navy, or really any store nowadays. And there are significant components of globalization implied in all of that. All right, the cultural ecology, the idea of determinism versus possibilism. Determinism is highly considered to be out of play. It's not really believed in anymore, but it's worth at least talking about it. And that's the idea that environment shapes your culture versus possibilism, which means humans choose. And frankly, I don't know why the two O's here are small. In any event, humans choose opportunities to develop their culture based on the environment that they inhabit. Okay. Here, for example, agricultural lands along the US-Mexico border, or whether it be an irrigation system in an area that gets very little rain, and how you take advantage of oases and different water resources. underground. Or in this case, we're talking about huts on stilts on the Mekong Delta in Vietnam. And these are essentially built above water level, not necessarily for flood protection, but because they basically are above where the mosquitoes are at night, so that you then reduce the threat of malaria. Okay, because mosquitoes live within about 4 to 5 feet above water. That's it. They don't really go any higher than that. So therefore, if you build your living space above it, even though this is primitive living space, it's still, there's quite a bit of thought that went into it. Or for example, windmills in Holland. I mean, this is sort of like a romanticized view of it nowadays. Everything is a lot more modern and technologically developed, but this is a way of fighting back the encroachment of the North Sea. Or in an area where terrain doesn't allow for much farming and agriculture, then you have essentially the idea of setting up these terraces that you can use to do things like rice farming. Okay. So roots of culture, I'm gonna forget the idea here and just look at the map, the idea of what happened, some of the routes that took place as people began to move across Earth and across the space. Remember back a long time ago when there was an ice age, land used to extend a lot further. There were bridges, you know, where you have ocean now, for example, the Bering Strait, and all these islands were connected. So there's one big piece of land, so people could freely travel. And so that's the you know, how people initially began to move across Earth space. We'll talk about the idea of change when it comes to culture. We'll talk about that. And think about the idea of plant and animal domestication. All the things that you think of when you think of the prototypical American breakfast, right? Bacon, eggs, toast, orange juice, coffee. Most of that comes from basically not the United States. So when you think about things like coffee, that comes from Africa. When you think about anything that has to do with citrus, we're talking about Asia, so oranges. When you think about pancakes and anything that has to do with the milling of grains, that comes from other areas besides the United States. Really, the only part of an American breakfast that is truly American would be maple syrup. So really, that's about it. So it gives you a sense of not only plant and animal domestication, but the movement of those items across the earth. I'm going to talk about a cultural hearth, and this is a place of origin for any culture whose group developed systems of livelihood and created a distinctive cultural landscape. Some of them would be Mesoamerica, the Aztecs and the Maya. The Andes led way to, for example, the Inca. Africa, Mesopotamia, what we call the Fertile Crescent of present-day Iraq and Syria and Jerusalem and Jordan. And of course, you have Hindu in the Indus Valley and Chinese in China, of course. And the movement away from those locations, those hearths, okay? We're going to talk about change, and we're going to talk about, I want to get to the, here we go, the structure of culture. You can think of it as ideological, technological, and sociological. So an ideological system, a technological system, for example, is the material stuff. So when you think about baseball, you think about the uniform, you think about the tools, you think about the stadiums, you think about the field and the rules. You think about sociological, you think about institutions, organizations, church, school. You can attend a church even if you're not a religious person, but you use it as a way of meeting people in, you know, singles nights and that kind of stuff. So that's more social in its context. Political institutions, Democrats, Republicans, independents, socialists, communists, whatever they may be. That's a sociological subsystem. And finally, ideological subsystems, ideas, beliefs, the way you think, the way you philosophize. Okay, so that's where that comes in. All right. So let's talk about cultural change, innovation, and diffusion. So the process of, diffusion is the process by which an idea or innovation is transmitted from one individual or group to another. And innovation implies there's a cultural lag sometimes, there's resistance to change. Think about the Amish, think about Hasidics. And Hasidics are different than the Amish, obviously, but they're different in the way they approach the world. Like Hasidics use technology, they have Wi-Fi, iPhones, all that kind of stuff, right? Amish, by and large, do not. So there's different ways that they approach that resistance to culture. So in the case of the Hasidics, they integrate a lot of technological, new cars and technology and GPS and phones and websites, whereas the Amish do not. But they each has its own set of cultural resistance mechanisms that are employed in the way of thinking about the modern or the regular world. Like any one of us, some of us choose not to take part in social media. So when you do that, because social media has become such a huge part of life, whether it be things like, of course, Facebook and Instagram and LinkedIn, let's see, Snapchat and WhatsApp and TikTok and all this other crap that's out there. Some people choose not to take part in that. Doesn't mean they're completely isolated from the world, but they have a very limited structure. Twitter would be another one. So, it's become a little bit more complicated in the age of social media, but it's still the same ideology applies. Here's how ideas change: by expansion and by relocation. When you talk about expansion, is an issue of idea. You have contagious diffusion and hierarchical diffusion. So hierarchical diffusion is sort of like anything that has to do with popular culture. So let's pick someone like, I don't know, a Taylor Swift. Back in the day, a Madonna. More current would be someone like Beyonce, or pick any popular movie star or singer. Okay. And let's say she suddenly begins to wear a specific but odd style of clothing, or they use a particular word or something that becomes very popular. And because they are at the height of their popularity, suddenly people below them, and by that I mean us, begin to use it. And as a result, it expands hierarchically from the top down. Relocation diffusion is more historical. So think about places today where Spanish is spoken: Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, Mexico, Argentina, Venezuela. Why? Because the Spanish colonized that area. And what is also practiced in most of those places? Roman Catholicism. Now, in other places, the language may be French. In other places, it might be English, and so on. So that's the idea of relocation diffusion. With contagious diffusion, distance is a factor. Okay? With hierarchical diffusion, it's a little bit more sort of rank oriented. Okay? And when it comes to relocation diffusion, distance is not a factor because you take it with you. So imagine this right here would be, say, Spain back in the era of Columbus, right? And what happened? They went to the New World, the Western world, and they took with them Spanish, Roman Catholicism, and all those very Spanish things that you can to this day see, the way the churches look and the way the cities look. It's all a function of that Spanish relocation, or Portuguese, or French, or British, or Irish, or German, or Dutch, whatever the case might be. Okay? Acculturation is when culture is modified, the adoption of traits of another dominant group. I like to think of people who move to the United States and as who were not born in the U.S., but then they have kids in the U.S. Those kids and those adults are going to acculturate, meaning they're going to adopt some of the language. Like, for example, in New York, neighbors of mine who are Muslim from Pakistan, they put up Christmas lights. They're not Christians. They don't really celebrate Christmas, but they put up Christmas lights because they think it looks cool. They like the way it looks. They think it's pretty. They don't put up a tree, but they put lights outside. And, it's just a way of adapting, of sort of taking in some of the ideology and some of the things that you like about something else and adopting it for yourself. In many cases, migrant populations want their kids to know only English because they themselves, the parents, may not be as good with English. So what happens? They basically almost have their kids become almost English only. That doesn't happen all the time, but that's a way of thinking about the idea of acculturation. Again, some of the contacts between regions, the idea of the diffusion barriers and syncretism. And here's some examples of diffusion. Sushi restaurants or Japanese cuisine in a place like New York, or pizzerias, or German-American food, where I'm almost certain that if you brought an actual German person or someone Mexican or someone Chinese or someone that is Italian or someone that's Japanese to any one of these places, they may not say, well, this isn't really German or Chinese. It's kind of, but not really. Why? Because we have adapted it to American tastes. Please do not mistake Taco Bell for Mexican food, because it's not. It's real Mexican food. Is quite different, quite delicious, frankly, but it's not the sort of homogenized Taco Bell crap that you get out of Taco Bell. Most Japanese places, they're quite good. And there's a little bit more similarity between what you find at a Japanese restaurant in the US and what you would find in Japan, but it's not exact. Why? Because it's been adapted to an American taste. Same thing with Chinese. Go to actual China and eat Chinese food, and it's going to be a lot more vegetarian, and it's going to be a lot less saucy. In other words, it's going to be less covered in sauce. Another example would be confusing, the Olive Garden with Italian food, right? Nobody would do that. No, I'm not saying nothing wrong with the Olive Garden. They make perfectly fine food, but it's Italian-ish, but it's not really Italian food. And Italian food is quite different. If you go to northern Italy versus Sicily versus Tuscany versus the Amalfi Coast, it's just like in the US, lots and lots of variety. So, here in the US, we tend to call Italian anything with marinara sauce, cheese, and some pasta. And that's a ridiculous generalization. I'm not saying it's bad. It's quite tasty, but it doesn't sort of bridge the entirety of what Italian food really is. So again, a way of thinking about it. Hopefully that is helpful to you. This is, next we're going to talk about chapter 3, spatial interaction and behavior. If you have any questions, let me know. Hope you have a fantastic week 2, chapter 2, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye.